This video is brought to you by my fantastic supporters over at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/TJTheEmperor to find out how you can support the channel.
And now, our feature presentation.
Hi friends, this is
Part 4
of the Complete Xenogears Reference Guide. As always, if you notice anything I forgot or got wrong, leave me a comment about it, and if I get enough of them, I'll make an addendum video and give you credit for whatever you found. Alright, enjoy the video. Alright, let's switch back over to Fei and Elly, who after the Goliath was shot down, spent days drifting around the open sea before being rescued by the Thames. The two use the opportunity to get some much needed R&R, and are introduced to the colorful captain and encounter another dolphin human named Hans. Now about Hans, you remember the dolphin man aboard the Yggdrasil named Franz, and how he was originally named Vance, but the translators switched the two names around for what seemed like no discernible reason? With Hans, I think we found it. For now we have a pair of linked characters named Hans and Franz. For those who don't know, Hans and Franz are characters from a famous series of sketches that aired on Saturday Night Live in the late 80s and early 90s. The two men, played by Dana Carvey and Kevin Nealon, are two flamboyant Arnold Schwarzenegger-esque bodybuilders known for wanting to pump you up. The only reason I can fathom as to why Richard Honeywood would switch the names is so there could be this reference to the Hans and Franz sketch. I know it sounds odd, but I can't think of any other reason. Anyway, eventually Gebler attacks the Thames, both to kill Fei and to bring Elly back into the fold. They're unsuccessful on both fronts. However, Fei is critically injured in the process. Gebler is beaten back, in part, thanks to a man named Billy Lee Black, a member of a society within the ethos called the E-Tones, charged with eliminating mutants called Wells. Along with Billy, we're also introduced to his rather obnoxious father Josiah, or Jessie. The name Josiah, meaning man of God in Hebrew, is given to several very minor figures in the Old Testament, while the name Jessie, although admittedly spelled differently than it is in the game, is the father of King David. As far as I know, these names don't have any significance to his character. Afterwards, the party brings Fei to the Ethos Infirmary for treatment. While there, a man named Verlaine approaches Billy and talks to him about Jessie. The name Verlaine would seem to be a reference to Paul Verlaine, the French symbolist poet of the 19th century. After dropping Fei off, the crew heads to an orphanage Billy runs. Talking to some of the NPCs there leads to some pretty interesting conversations, including one that reveals another ancient myth. This time, the story concerns the legend of Babel Tower. The story goes that in the past, humans built a tower so they could reach God, but God was displeased by this and destroyed it. The people were so afraid that they ran to Shevat, referred to as the House of Sinning Hermits. Obviously, the story is highly inspired by the Tower of Babel from the 11th chapter of Genesis, and honestly, the story here is pretty damn close to the biblical tale. Ancient man decides to build a city and a tower to reach God so they wouldn't be scattered over the face of the earth. God was not happy at their doings, and so to stop them attempting anything similar, scattered them across the earth and confused their language. As you can see, very similar. The major difference is that the Genesis story focuses heavily on the role of language, which is absent in the Xenogears retelling. Further, in Xenogears, the men of Shevat are explicitly told that they were afraid and have become sinning hermits. This is a pretty major addition, which makes you consider what exactly the sins of Shevat were. Talking to another NPC reveals another story about Shevat, and I'm just gonna read it verbatim because it's so damn weird. About 50 years ago, an old man, Henry Mingas, said he was taken by the saucer and his body was altered. Well, no one believed him, but afterward it said that he had amazing knowledge and skills he never had before. Then 10 years ago, strange circle-shaped marks were found in many places. You must have heard about it. No? Well, anyway, they were called mystery circles. So this guy spread rumors that they were saucer landing sites, and when others began to disappear, there was even more talk. But there were other things than the saucer landing site explanation, such as the naughty stories, dragon scrolls, or plasma legend. So there was no real proof, but real disappearances did happen. Oh, I forgot to mention, the saucer is called Shevat. There are even people who worship it. Abductions and crop circles are common cultural signifiers for alien activity, so those don't confuse me. But so much else in this story seems so bizarrely specific that it feels like they must have been references to something. I mean, the name Henry Mingas? How about Naughty Stories, Dragon Scrolls, or Plasma Legend? I've searched high and low for what significance any of these names could have, but I've come up empty. Again, they seem way too specific to be arbitrary, but who knows, maybe I'm making much ado about nothing. Anyway, the party accompanies Billy on one of his Wells extermination missions. In the process, we meet Billy's gear, the Renmazuo. Renmazuo is a Chinese way of referring to the constellation Sagittarius, placing it in good company with the other zodiacal gear names. At the end of the mission, the party returns to the Ethos HQ, only to find the scene of a massacre. Soon thereafter, they learn the truth about the organization, that it's actually a subsidiary of Solaris organized to effectively control the surface dwellers. Over time, some in the Ethos actually plan on breaking free from Solaris' control and controlling the Earth on their own. The Etones were, in part, organized to hunt these traitors down, so says the head of the Etones, Bishop Isaac Stone. The name Isaac is another reference to the Book of Genesis, the son of Abraham who was nearly sacrificed by him on Mount Moriah. I don't think there's any deep significance to this, but when Stone reveals his true face, this is an obvious reference to the face of Red Skull, the historic nemesis of Captain America from the Marvel Universe. After revealing Billy's entire worldview to be nothing but a sham, Stone, or Stein to use his true name, escapes in a giant white gear called the Alkanshel. The name Alkanshel, based on how Japanese could be Romanized, could be a reference to one of two things, the word Archangel or the word Arc-en-Ciel, which is French for rainbow. Honestly, I don't know which one of the two is the correct one. The party tracks Stein to the Zebulun ruins, and finds a massive, ultra-modern ruined city. Shitan compares the ruins to a labyrinth, and that labyrinths are usually made to seal something inside them. In classical mythology, the labyrinth was, in fact, a structure designed by Daedalus to keep a monster inside, the monster in this case being the Minotaur of Crete. Thankfully, no Minotaur is to be found at the center of these ruins. Instead, the party finds a nanomachine colony in the form of a little girl. Stein shows up in time to take the little girl with him, leaving the party to deal with two members of the elements, Tolone and Seraphita. As we've come to expect, their names are references to two other orders of angels, Throne for Tolone and Seraphim for Seraphita. As the party talks to the girls, there follows what is perhaps one of the most bizarre bits of dialogue in all of Xenogears. I'm again going to read it verbatim. Psychologically superior? Your gin and tonic futon brain cyborg implants sure make you smart. That's positronic photon brain, you idiot. Gin and tonic futon... You make me sound like I'm a sleepy drunk. It's already bad enough as it is. Positronic photon brain cyborg? That's bound to get us into trouble with the makers of Star TRECH. Oh boy, where to even start with this? The positronic photon brain is a reference to Star Trek The Next Generation. The character Data has a positronic brain. This makes the reference to Star TRECH at the end of the line make sense. The thing is though, none of these Star Trek references are anywhere in the Japanese script. According to the Xenogears and Xenosaga Study Guide, the term that was translated as gin and tonic futon brain was, in Japanese, polychlorotoluene, while Kaisen from Resonant Art confirms the line about them getting in trouble with the makers of Star Trek was, in Japanese, something closer to that's gonna get caught in the inspection. If I were to venture a guess, I think Richard Honeywood invoked this whole series of Star Trek references as a way to write the cumbersome word polychlorotoluene out of the script, as well as keep the tone of the Japanese as best he could. Because, make no mistake, even without the Star Trek references, the Japanese version still breaks the fourth wall in what's honestly a pretty inappropriate time. This entire scene, in whatever language you read it in, is just weird, and there's no getting around that. Of course, the party defeats the elements, and catch up with Stone at the exit. Before they can do anything, though, the mysterious Red Gear shows up, introducing himself as id. Id, along with ego and superego, is one of the three components of the psyche according to Freud, the id being the facet that acts according to primal urges and desires. For a destructive character like him, the name is fitting. Before id can cause any real trouble for our heroes, Wiseman shows up in his gear to hold him back, giving everyone else a chance to escape. The party moves to take care of Stein aboard the Alkanshel, but Graf picks this as the perfect time to show up and give Stein his power. As a result, the Alkanshel is able to manifest an impregnable barrier, almost certainly guaranteeing his victory. All hope is not lost, however, as Jessie has an idea to break through the barrier. He's going to use the Buntline, a gear that transforms into a gun and shoots the pilot as its bullet. The Buntline is, actually, the name of a real gun, a long-barreled variant of the greatest handgun ever made, the Colt Single Action Army. 6 bullets, more than enough to kill anything that moves. Before launching himself at the barrier, Jessie gives his son some words of wisdom to guide him through this difficult time, one of which is the idea that guns don't kill people, people kill people. This exact sentence has been used by the National Rifle Association as an anti-gun control slogan dating back to the 1910s. That being the case, I'm willing to bet the line probably wasn't written that way in the Japanese script, although I don't know for sure. In either case, perhaps because I'm American, reading that honestly took me right out of the game. Anyway, Alkanshel is defeated, and as a bonus, Jessie didn't actually die when he shot himself out of the Buntline. So everyone regroups to consider their next steps, with Jessie filling the rest of the crew in on Solaris' plans. When he was in Solaris, he discovered that lambs were being kidnapped and transformed into wells as part of something called the Malakh, or M-Plan. We've heard about the M-Plan, or M-Project, in an earlier scene with the Gazel Ministry, and here we learn that M stands for Malakh, the Hebrew word literally meaning messenger, but when used in biblical tradition refers to the angels. We'll have to wait a bit longer to figure out what this M-Project really entails. Jessie continues. The truth of the M-Project was apparently hidden in a test gear by the scientist in charge, who then sent that test gear, along with his daughter as the pilot, into hiding. Apparently the gear is in Shevat, but nobody knows how to actually get to Shevat. Lucky for them, at just that moment, a Shevat agent that was rescued during the raid on the Ethos HQ tells them not only the names of the figures they're looking for, Maria and Nicolai, but also a way to contact Shevat, climbing to the top of Babel Tower. 2 things before we move on. First, Babel Tower is apparently a real structure in this world, and second, about Maria and Nicolai, I'm going to hold off on talking about them for right now, but we'll return shortly. The scene cuts to another conversation between Krelian and the Gazel Ministry. The one new reference here is that Krelian drops the name of the computer where the Ministry resides, the Sol 9000. This is an obvious reference to the HAL 9000, the nefarious supercomputer from Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 A Space Odyssey. The Sol in its name could be the Latin word for sun, but given who controls it, it's just as likely to simply be a reference to Solaris. Alright, back to our heroes. They climb Babel Tower and meet Maria, who acts as a sort of guard for Shevat. After a time, the voice of Shevat's queen, Zephyr, grants them passage, and at this point, we're going to have to take another pause, as there are a lot of references to discuss. Let's get the simplest out of the way first. Queen Zephyr. Zephyr is Greek, the word for the mythological west wind. As for Maria, her real name is Maria Balthazar, the granddaughter of Old Man Ball, the guy Fei and Bart met in the cavern at the very beginning of the game. That's the reason why Maria's gear looks so much like Calamity, the prototype gear Fei fought before exiting the cavern. Let's talk a bit about Maria's gear, as there's a lot to unpack. The name of the gear is Siebzehn, the German word for the number 17. This name, and I have to thank TV Tropes, of all places, for cluing me in on this, seems to be a reference to an obscure 70s tokusatsu show called Daitetsujin 17. The color scheme of the 17 is similar to that of the Siebzehn, and the two even share a similar special attack, the Gravitone for the 17, and the Gravitation Cannon for the Siebzehn. Further, as the Gazel Ministry makes clear, the Siebzehn has a brother gear in the Ministry's control called Achtzehn, German for 18. In Daitetsujin 17, the 17 similarly has a brother robot called the 18. Admittedly, the 18 looks nothing like the Achtzehn, but the other similarities make it clear that this is probably what the developers were going for. We're not done with Maria and her gear yet, though. Aside from sharing a color scheme with the 17, the Siebzehn also seems a blatant reference to another legendary mech, Giant Robo. Giant Robo, for those unaware, is a franchise created by manga artist Mitsuteru Yokoyama in 1967, and adapted as a popular live-action TV series that same year. In 1992, the series was adapted into an OVA called Giant Robo, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and I think it's this OVA in particular that served as inspiration for not just Siebzehn's design, but Maria's character as well. First, if we look at Siebzehn's design, it doesn't look too much like the 60s Giant Robo, but if we compare it to the 90s Giant Robo, the resemblance is much more striking. But beyond even that, consider the backstories. In Giant Robo, the titular robot was designed by Dr. Kusama against his will by the evil organization Big Fire. To ensure that Big Fire could not actually use the machine, Dr. Kusama made it so it only could be piloted by his son Daisaku. In Xenogears, the Siebzehn was designed by Nicolai Balthazar against his will by Solaris. After it was completed, he programmed it to flee with his daughter to Shevat. Though different at minor points, the main tenors of the story are very similar. It's more than likely that Takahashi was actively following the Giant Robo OVA throughout the 90s, given that its director, Yasuhiro Imagawa, was also the director of one of his favorite TV shows of that decade, G Gundam. Alright, enough of that. Now safely on Shevat, our heroes take in the sights, including the room of a child that was destroyed during the war with Solaris 500 years ago and preserved in that state ever since. I have to thank Resonant Arc for pointing this out, but the room could easily be a reference to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, a building that managed to miraculously survive the atomic blast that struck that city on August 6, 1945. The building was maintained in its partially ruined state ever since, as a perpetual reminder of the horrors of atomic warfare. If one talks to the NPCs around the city, you can hear two more ancient myths, both of which are related to the paradise in the sky called Mahanon. The name Mahanon, according to David Godwin, the author of Godwin's Kabbalistic Encyclopedia, is the fourth of the seven heavens, and in some traditions is the heavenly home of the Garden of Eden, though others place it in the third. I'm not going to go over the myths in detail, as they're pretty close to the one we heard from Old Man Ball in the cavern, which makes sense given that he also comes from Shevat. I will, however, point out the notable additions that aren't found in Ball's version. The humans who rebelled against God are said to have used the strength of the 12 Anima relics to give them divine power. The first time in the game the Anima relics have been connected with strength. The war against God is specifically said to have lasted 10 days and nights, and this seems to echo a passage from the Greek poet Hesiod. In his Theogony, it's said that the Titans who rebelled against the Olympians were banished to Tartarus, which is so far below the earth that it would take an anvil 9 days and 9 nights to reach it, hitting the ground on the 10th. The echo seems to further emphasize the rebellion. One last difference. The righteous men left on Earth after the war are forced to live a harsh life in nature. This parallels the fates of Adam and Eve after being expelled from Eden. God tells Adam that the ground is cursed for their sake. After an intense battle with Solaris that sees the destruction of the Achtzehn and the death of Nicolai, the party reconvenes to meet with Zephyr, who tells them some disturbing news. Shah Khan's forces have invaded Nisan in a desperate attempt to claim the legendary treasure of Ave by force. She also reveals what exactly the treasure is, an Omnigear, sealed by Bart's ancestor Roni Fatima. The name Roni is, believe it or not, another reference. It's the middle name of another Square RPG hero, Final Fantasy VI's lecherous king Edgar Figaro. Kaori Tanaka, the primary writer of Xenogears, wrote the backstories for Edgar and his brother Sabin, and so decided to use Roni's name as a subtle reference to what is perhaps her most famous creation. Zephyr also tells the party that Gaspar, one of the sages of Shevat and the man who taught both Khan and Wiseman martial arts, has returned, and is willing to help them out. Oh yeah, I should mention, Wiseman is there too, revealed to be another agent working for Shevat. This is as good a time as any to discuss what seems to be another reference in Wiseman's name, and I have to give credit to the Xenosaga wiki for pointing me here. Apparently, Wiseman is also a reference to a story by Henry Van Dyke called The Other Wise Man. In that story, a fourth wise man gives Jesus 3 gemstones as a gift. Wiseman's room in Shevat is sealed by 3 stones. All of this taken together, he should be considered the unofficial 4th sage of Shevat. Before we move on, I want to take another minute to discuss one more reference concerning Shevat as a whole. It seems that Shevat is meant to be one big echo to the Kingdom of Zeal from Chrono Trigger. The two nations are similar in many ways. They float above the earth, are ruled by a queen whose name begins with a Z, and are advised by a group of wise old men named after the biblical magi, to name just a few. To go even further, remember that Xenogears was, at one point, going to be a sequel to Chrono Trigger. It's possible, therefore, that Shevat was at one point actually supposed to be Zeal, and was turned into Shevat once Xenogears became its own property. One more reference here. The party meets with Gaspar, who, to help them out, removes from their genes something called a limiter. A limiter is actually a real term in electrical engineering, defined as a circuit that, surprise surprise, limits the output of something by preventing it from exceeding a certain value. In the context of the game, limiters seem to have been put into human beings to prevent them from becoming too powerful. Though the journey is long and difficult, the party does, in fact, discover the great treasure of Ave, and in the process, manage to activate the Omnigear, defeat Shah Khan, and restore Bart to the throne, ending the war with Kislev. One quick word about Bart's Omnigear. It's called Andvari, and as can be gleaned from just the sound of it, it's another reference to Norse myth. Andvari is the name of a dwarf, who had a magic ring that could be used to find gold.